The city of Homs, once known as the capital of the revolution, is now back in the government's control. But years of shelling and military siege have left its neighborhoods hardly recognizable to those who call it home. And for the 2.8 million refugees living in Lebanon and Jordan, many are left to wonder if they'll ever be able to return home. Joining us now is former U.S. Senator Norm Coleman. Senator Coleman served the people of Minnesota from 2003 to 2009 and is now an attorney with the international law firm Hogan Lovells right here in Washington, D.C. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure to be with you, Anand. Thank you.
So, as we just heard, a major development in the Syrian civil war. Rebels forced out of the city of Homs. The government has retaken control. Is Bashar al-Assad winning this war?
Well, he's certainly not gone, and he continues to commit atrocities against his people. Just a couple of weeks ago, the French highlight, I think, 14 instances of new use of chemical weapons. So he's using chemical weapons, he's killing his own people. The scope of the Syrian crisis and the amount of death and carnage that he's imposed upon his people is really pretty overwhelming. I think it's one of the great tragedies of our time. So it's not over, but he's certainly not gone, and his ability to inflict great damage continues, I think, almost unabated.
You said during the last election campaign, when you were part of the Mitt Romney campaign, we should be arming those who are supporting the opposition. Supplying arms to whom?
Well, listen, Java was in town. They had the Syrian National Coalition forces are in town. The problem is, if we had done it then, it would be a lot easier to answer that question. Because at an early point in time, I think there was some clear distinctions between what I would call the good guys and the bad guys. There are folks that we don't want to put weapons in the hands of, and unfortunately, because we waited so long, because we were so meek in our response, that we didn't. The president said that there was going to be a red line. If Syria crossed the red line with the use of chemical weapons, we were going to do something. Well, the red line was crossed, and we did nothing. And so as a result, it's a more difficult question to answer now, but I do think one can identify those responsible forces, those forces committed to democracy. As I said, Jabra was in town, met with the president just a couple of weeks ago. And again, the chemical attacks continue. This is not just something we talk about that happened before. Just recently, the French again have highlighted at least 14 instances. I'm aware that Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Speaker Royce, wrote a letter to the president just last week, saying that we have to do something to deter or diminish Assad's ability to use these chemical weapons, including perhaps the supplying of arms to those responsible forces in the region. But it's a much more difficult question to answer now.
President Obama addressed the situation in Syria during his recent foreign policy speech at West Point. Let's take a listen to what he said about Syria. Let's watch.
As president, I made a decision that we should not put American troops into the middle of this increasingly sectarian war. And I believe that is the right decision. But that does not mean we shouldn't help the Syrian people stand up against a dictator who bombs and starves his own people.
So, President Obama, they're talking about Syria. Given those concerns that you've just expressed, one can perhaps understand the reticence on the part of this administration to supply arms to the rebels.
Again, I think, unfortunately, the reticence has gone on so long that it's made it a much more difficult decision. The president's right. This is not about putting troops on the ground, and the United States has no desire, no intention. That's not going to happen. The president once said that when dictators commit atrocities, they depend on the world to look the other way. And in fact, unfortunately, we have. Those are words, but they haven't been followed by action. And so when the president said a red line is going to be crossed, and if you cross that red line and use chemical weapons, we're going to respond in some way, we should have responded, and we didn't. And so in the end, you can't simply do nothing. So the president's words, those are pretty good words, but you got to translate them into action. Unfortunately, they haven't been translated into action. Secretary Kerry, I think, when the allegations raised by the French about the latest use of chemical attacks, he talked about referring the incident to these incidents to the World Court. This is not a matter for the World Court.
Right, but when you say these words have to be translated into action, one sees the problem that the administration has here. You've said that yourself. Well,
and again, a problem that they created, that there was a period in time in which it would be easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you just sit back and do nothing, then you give Assad free rein to do what he's doing. And again, and this is one in which we're not doing it alone. And in fact, as I keep mentioning the French, and there are others in the international community, they're saying enough is enough, that use of chemical weapons, the entire international community has to abhor the use of chemical weapons. And so I think one has to be strategic about it, with caution. This is not reckless abandon, but one, it's not troops on the ground, not boots on the ground, and it's not simply indiscriminate kind of distributing weapons to any and all parties. But I do think I think Jarba, and representing some of the force in the Syrian coalition, can provide some measure of comfort to again deter Assad's capacity to be using these chemical weapons.
Right. You know, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, said about the Syrian National Council, it can no longer be viewed as the visible leader of the opposition.
Well, she's not Secretary of State now, and I don't think there's any question that right now they are the visible leader. Again, I mean, one of the challenges we have is because we didn't act early enough. We let some of the forces tied to al-Qaeda, forces tied to extremism, we let them have a free hand. They were the ones that were out there without us doing anything. But that's not to say that all the forces involved in fighting Assad are within that universe. And so one has to, I think, be strategic in this. And again, I go back to the president's words. You can't. Inaction is not a choice here. So there has to be some efforts to simply say that this is not acceptable. And again, that something will be done so that again, dictators don't allow the world to turn their back when they're committing atrocities.
Right. Let me ask you about international help in resolving this crisis. Getting on board a coalition. Countries like Russia, countries like China. The United States has problems with both those countries right now. So it's highly unlikely that those countries are going to come on board.
So an international coalition doesn't mean that you need everybody's approval or assent. The Russians, unfortunately, are problematic in a lot of areas right now. And whether it's the Ukraine or whether it's with Iran or whether it's with Syria. And so whether we get Russian support or not is not critical. You can form an international coalition. It doesn't have to be a coalition of everyone. And it's one of the challenges with the United Nations. That in effect, that one or two parties can simply stop a broader coalition from moving forwards. So I'm not saying that you need everyone's approval. And the Russians have their own interests, and the Chinese may have their own interests. But I do think it's a shame. I do think any civilized people would look at the use of chemical weapons, look at the level of violence and destruction and carnage that Assad has perpetrated on his people, and say, let's come together. And there are those in the international community that are willing to do that. And we should be joining with them, even if the Russians and the Chinese choose not to participate.
Okay, very quickly, we're running out of time. President Assad has now announced elections. Those elections are going to be held. Are they going to have the effect of, to some extent, legitimizing his rule?
And elections do not a democracy make. Elections do not legitimacy make. You're having elections in part of the country. You can't have an elections because he doesn't control those parts of the country.
I mean, we had a similar situation in Ukraine. There was one part of the country that couldn't vote or couldn't vote in the numbers that we'd expected. We had a similar situation in Egypt where an entire party...
I'd separate Egypt from the Ukraine. But the Ukraine, you're right. You had parts of the country. Was that an election? Right. In Egypt, you had an election. A party didn't participate, but you had pretty massive turnout. You're not seeing the kind of massive turnout in the millions in Syria. The bottom line is that this election is not going to legitimize Assad. This election is not going to wipe away the stain that he has kind of put on his people by the level of carnage and death that has rained down from him, and we need to do something more to deal with it.
Right, and when you talk about bringing other countries in, do you also need to bring in countries like Iran, countries like Saudi Arabia? I mean, in many instances, some analysts see this as a proxy war between the two large groupings in Islam, Sunnis versus Shiites.
You know, it's a very good question. I think we certainly need the region to be involved. The question is whether folks want to be constructive. So if you're there, if the Iranians are supporting the use of terrorism, if they're supporting the use of chemical, whatever it is, then they're not part of the discussion. But do you need folks in the region to be involved in the conversation? Absolutely. Do the Saudis need to be involved in the conversation? Absolutely. So this is not the United States alone. It is not everyone in the world together. It is those folks in the region. It is the coalition of the concerned being willing to step forward to say the use of chemical weapons is not going to be allowed during our lifetime.
Senator Coleman, thank you very much for joining us.
Great pleasure. Thank you.